right. Hello, everyone. Seems we are live now, so exciting. Happy to get started. We already have quite a few people on the line. Let's wait for a few more seconds so that everyone gets the chance to join in before we actually get started. Theme of today, Master the Vainu Basics. Very, very interesting stuff. Hopefully all of you will learn something new about Vainu, or at least remind yourselves about some features of Vainu. That's the goal for us, at least for today. My name is Marco. I work as a solution engineer here at Vainu, so I'm part of our customer success team, and I am not here alone today. I actually have my colleague Sini also behind the curtain, so to speak, looking after the chat. So if you send any questions, if you have anything you want to mention on the chat, she will be there taking care of that part while I'm doing most of the presentations. Yes, let's test a bit the interactive element. So go say hi in the chat, and let's also actually open up a quick poll before we actually get started. So hopefully the poll will appear. The question is, how much have you already used Vainu until now? Are you entirely new to Vainu? Have you used Vainu already before? Let's gauge how much people have actually knowledge about Vainu already beforehand, so we understand a bit what we're dealing with here. We're going to have a roughly 45-minute session today. Let's spend around half an hour me just presenting, demoing Vainu's platform, and then we'll have hopefully 10 to 15 minutes roughly to go through any questions that you may have. So feel free to send any questions that come up during the presentation, if anything. All right, let's see the answers for the poll. Mostly it's for people, it's just scratching the surface so far. For a small amount of people, no experience with Vainu, and some people know the basics quite well. So that's a great starting point for today. So as mentioned, we have 30 minutes. It's not that much for all the different stuff that Vainu's platform can offer. So we'll be going through these pretty quickly. But of course, the recording of this session will be saved and will actually be in our help center, the same place where we actually already have the Finnish and Swedish webinars that were held before summer. And I'm actually going to share you the link. It should appear on the bottom of the page right about now. So that page already contains the Finnish and Swedish webinars, which has more or less the same contents that we go through today. Maybe some small differences in the ordering of the stuff and what actually gets presented, but it's more or less the same content. So if you prefer watching these in Finnish or in Swedish, you can of course take a look at those as well. And as mentioned, this webinar recording will also end up on that same page later on. But good. So as mentioned, the theme for today, mastering the Vainu basics. So we're talking about Vainu's platform specifically. And some people who might have followed us quite a lot these past months or the past year know that we've been very, very active in all things outside Vainu's platform. So we've been talking a lot about agents and Vainu MCP. We just released our CLI. So there's a lot of three-letter abbreviations being thrown around, which are not related to our platform, but are actually used usually somewhere else than on our platform. But I think there's still always very good reasons why we should know the basics of the platform. Obviously, there's still a lot of use cases where platform usage is key. And even when most of the users might be in a CRM system, they might be using different LLMs. But usually there's always at least like one admin user who is still spending a lot of their time on Vainu's platform, creating lists, creating triggers. So they at least need to understand how our platform works. And even if you don't use Vainu's platform, even if you only operate in a CRM system, if you only talk with agents, I think it's still useful to understand how the platform works, how our filters work, how triggers are built, because those same basic building blocks are very useful, even if you actually use Vainu from somewhere else than our platform. So that's why I think it is very valuable and very useful for everyone to get the basics of how to work around our platform. Good. So let's then jump into the actual presentation of our platform. Let me share my screen right away. There we go. So now hopefully everyone is seeing our platform opened up. Couple quick mentions. If your own Vainu platform for some reason looks different, one very potential reason for this is that you may still be using the older platform and not the newer platform that I'm using right here. To access the newer platform, the address is vainu.app. So vainu.app. Same login credentials, same email, same password that you used for the old platform. But now we highly recommend everyone using the newer platform. At some point, we will be closing down the older platform, and pretty much all the features that we used to have on the older platform have already been brought to the newer platform. So there shouldn't be reasons anymore why you would be using the older platform at this point. Also, during the presentation, you might notice some filters, some features, some elements that are not visible on your own account. And that is very much possible because it depends on the permissions and the agreement that your organization has in place. So for example, on my screen, you can see some of the vehicle filtering up here, which might not appear on your platform if vehicle data is not part of your agreement. So don't be surprised about it. Those little differences here and there are very much possible. Most of the stuff that we discussed today is something that either all of our customers or most of our customers have. I will probably mention a few elements here and there that are not part of everyone's agreements, but just so you know that most of the stuff that we go through today are actually available for everyone, at least to some extent. Good. So let's start by discussing very briefly what we see here already on the screen that opens up when you go to Vainu's platform. On the top right corner, a couple of useful places. There's the link to our help center, a lot of useful documentation right there. The notifications are up here. There is some news from our marketing team, but also it gives an idea when you're, for example, exporting companies. Let's say you have a CRM integration ongoing. This is a great place to check if those exports have actually gone through and seeing if there are any errors, for example, so you can take a closer look at what actually failed when you tried to make those exports. So a very useful place at times. There's your personal user settings right over here. Very important to mention as well, at the bottom right corner, you can see the chat bubble. So whenever you have, actually, I can see that my own image is blocking the view right now, but basically right there on the bottom right corner, there is a chat bubble through which you can access our support team. So if you have any questions, any issues, you can send a message through there directly to them. And you can, of course, also send them an email to support@vainu.com. So both ways are perfectly valid when contacting our support team. And then here at the top, you have the database selection. So assuming your organization is using multiple country databases, you have here the option of selecting which database are you actually looking at any given time. So whenever you are building lists, using filters to narrow down your target groups, you are always acting within one specific country database. If you want to then build a similar list to a different country, you will need to first change the database from this drop-down menu and then create a similar list, for example, in that database. And then on the left-hand side, you have basically the list of all the different features that we have on our platform. So by default, you're looking at the company profiles or the lists. But there's also triggers, which we're going to take a look at a bit later. And then also connector settings, personal settings. You might have access to Discovery Agent. And at the bottom left corner, our data catalog, which goes a bit more technical into what data fields do we actually have in Vainu. tells you also in which countries are those data points available, because not all data points exist in every single country. And it also tells you, for example, if they are fields that you can use when filtering, when creating lists on Vainu. So a lot of cool information there as well that you might want to check at some point. Nice. Then we can jump into looking at the company cards. So when you have a list open, when you have created a list, you can already see here on the page that we have a bunch of different companies listed. And you can just click on any of those company cards to open up more information on that specific company. There are a bunch of tabs here at the top, which give you some idea on what kind of data do we have available. Most of the data that we actually collect are available on the company cards, so it gives you a good idea of what data do we actually have. The overview tab is usually very, very useful. It, first of all, contains our research agent. So research agent is something that we didn't used to have on our old platform. It's still a fairly new feature, which basically allows you to create a prompt and use that prompt against our AI to then go through the data, sift through the data, and return an output that you're interested in. So as a quick example, you could, for example, build a prompt that asks Vainu research agent to go through the company data. You can tell it some information about what your company does, what you yourself do, and then, for example, build a scoring on, is this a relevant company? Is this a relevant lead for us? And then give you some talking points as when you actually reach the company, what angle can you use at that point to basically sell the product, sell the service that you're offering, and discuss the correct things, basically. So the options there are unlimited. Whatever you want to prompt, you can get the stuff out of there. And as you can see, there's a drop down here where you can start by creating a new prompt. You can even let the AI help you generate a prompt, and then your prompt library starts appearing here. So you can always switch the prompt that you are actively using, and you can even select what is your default prompt. So always when you open up a company card, that default prompt is the one that will automatically run, as it did here in my example. So this prompt was automatically and immediately ran when I opened up this company card. Scrolling a bit lower, we see a lot of basic information for the company. So their business ID, when were they founded, some contact information. You have stuff like Vainu Custom Industries here as well, financials, employees, so contact data lives here as well. Events, meaning news items or new financial statements or any data that we have collected regarding this company, and then there might be office locations and whatnot. So a lot of information there. Some additional stuff can be found under these tabs, as mentioned. So for example, financial data in much more detail. If you have access to vehicle data, then you have that as well. Group data, also very useful. So gives you an idea of what companies actually belong to the same group with this particular company. And as you can see, it also shows different Nordic countries as well. So it doesn't only apply to this one database that you're currently looking at and where this company belongs. So there, and one thing that I also wanted to quickly mention about company cards, one question that we very often get from our customers is, I have this one company that I know is a great fit for us. How can I find more companies that are similar to this company? We, of course, have like our own similar companies feature down here. But what I actually suggest in more cases is that use good old reverse engineering, meaning if, for example, this company right here is your perfect company, so to speak, you can use these information here. For example, what industry does it belong to? How much revenue does this company report? How many employees do they have? And collect all this data and then use that when actually building a list on Vainu, because this gives you a great starting point of actually understanding what kind of company this is, and gives you kind of like the puzzle pieces needed to then actually find the lookalikes, find the similar companies using Vainu's lists. Good. I think that was a quick intro on what the company cards look like, and then we can move on to lists in more detail. So first of all, I want to talk about the difference between dynamic lists and static lists. Because as you can see, we have two different headers basically here on the left. We have my lists and we have custom lists. And my lists are basically dynamic lists in the sense that when you create a new list, you start setting up filters. It's basically Vainu's job automatically to keep that list up to date based on the filters that you have set. So if there are new companies that start filling those criteria that you have set, then Vainu will automatically include them on the list. And similarly, if for some reason one of these companies no longer match the criteria, then Vainu will automatically remove them from these lists. So you yourself do not need to make any changes. Vainu will constantly follow the filters that you have set and define if new companies now match the criteria, for example. Custom lists, on the other hand, are static lists, meaning that they are lists that you yourself need to manage. So they are lists that you have created, they are lists that you can add new companies into, and they are lists where you can yourself remove companies from. Vainu will not change anything on those lists because those lists do not have filters by design. They are just lists that you yourself have defined what companies actually belong to them. And I actually want to start talking about static lists. I think it's good to understand their logic first. There's basically two different ways of creating static lists. The first one is simply if you want to upload a list. So let's assume you have a spreadsheet of companies. You have one column containing the organization numbers of those companies, maybe another column that contains the names of those companies. So what you want to do in that case, you click here on the Create a List button, and then there's an option called Upload a List. And as you can see, it basically tells you that it expects to receive a CSV file or an Excel file, which hopefully contains at least the business IDs. And then when you click on the Upload button, it'll go through that list that you just uploaded and create a new, fresh custom list based on the companies that it was able to find from that list using those business IDs as the unique identifier for those companies. It could just be a column that only contains company names. That's fine as well, but just know that in some cases that might not be as accurate as when using business IDs, because business IDs are always unique. The other way to build a custom list is, let's assume that you have here a list that you have created. You might be interested in adding some of these companies to a custom list. So you could go and select any number of company cards from here. And then there is a button that appears that says Add to Custom List. And from here, you can either select any of your existing custom lists, or you can create a new custom list. And then these three selected companies in this case would be the first three companies on the new list that you created. You could also just select all of the companies on a list by clicking here. So now you can see that every single company, in this case, every single company in the Swedish database, since we don't have any filters applied, would be sent to this new custom list that you have created. The very common use case for static lists, there are many different use cases, but one very common is that people like to upload a list of, for example, their customers, a list of their competitors, a list of companies that they have researched but deemed maybe not relevant for them. So that way you have a list that you can then filter out from the actual target groups that you're building in Vainu, so that those companies do not appear on those lists because reasons X and Y. I'm going to show you a bit later how to actually do that, but just so you know that static lists are super useful for having actually these little building blocks that you can then remove from the lists that you start building using Vainu. Good. We can then move on to dynamic lists, the other type of list that we have. And as mentioned, dynamic lists are the lists where you yourself define the different filter criteria and Vainu builds the list based on those. So as you saw here, I didn't have any filters on this new list. So there is a whole total of almost 2 million different companies. That is all Swedish companies, basically. What we want to do here is start adding some filters so that we are not looking at 2 million companies, but rather the companies that actually match, for example, your ICP, companies that are really relevant for your business case. I'm going to showcase a few of these filters, but just so you know, behind the plus icon, there's a huge amount of them. I'm not going to go through all of them. So definitely take some time at some point to look at the different options that you have at hand. It really depends on your use case, which of these filters are useful for you. The three most commonly used are always here available by default. So industry, location, and company size. Industry contains two different options. So you have the official industry, meaning you'll see a list that looks like this. You can also change the language if you want, and you can select any industries that you might be interested in. The other option that we have is Vainu Custom Industry, which is our own industry taxonomy, which is especially useful if you're dealing with, let's say, more modern industries, because the classical official industry classification doesn't go very deep into what kind of, for example, technologies a company might be dealing with. But Vainu Custom Industry goes very much more into detail with those. In Vainu Custom Industry, you can just select any of the industries from our list. You can just type it in right here. And then by clicking on apply, we have our first filter in place. So now we're only dealing with companies that we in our Vainu Custom Industry have actually deemed as SaaS companies to begin with. So we can see that we only have 1,700 companies now from the 2 million that we just had after we implemented this one single filter. Then we have the location filters. So plenty of options here. You can start using, for example, the city where the company is based. You can even narrow down to a street address if you want. You can go higher up, so we can deal with provinces, meaning, for example, in Sweden's case, you have all of these options here. And you also have a map filtering option, which is very powerful in certain situations. So if you know, for example, that you're dealing with companies, let's say in Jönköping, Sweden, you could narrow down over here and then, for example, build a circle around the city. And this would now mean that we will be looking at all of the companies who have any locations within this area, within this circle. Note that there is this location type option also available always, which by default is set to any, meaning that it doesn't matter if we are looking at the headquarters of the company or if they have any office or factory or anything else within this area that you defined. If you want to be specific, if you want it to actually be the company headquarters that are based in this area, then you can choose it from this drop-down menu right here and define that you're actually only interested in the headquarters location. For our purposes here, let's just use a very simple location filtering. So let's go with location is any, and let's use Stockholm as our starting point. So this already narrows down our list a bit more. Now we only have 640 companies that are SaaS companies based in Stockholm. And then let's look at the company size filter. Again, you have a couple of different options that you can use here. We have employee counts and a few different metrics as well. Reported employees being the most commonly used, since that's the one that is directly derived from the financial statements of the company. So updated every year when companies release their financial statements, and it's from there that we get the reported employee count for these companies. But you could also use, for example, our own predicted company size model, which basically looks at the company website and tries to understand based on that if we're talking about a micro company or a bigger enterprise. And then, of course, you can also look at the revenue numbers. So if you're only interested in companies that have a revenue of, say, 100 million Swedish kronor, then you could just do something like this and apply. And now we can see that our list is further narrowed down. And now we only have 93 companies filling these 3 different criteria. And as mentioned, Vainu would now keep this list updated. So if some company, for example, drops below the revenue threshold that we set up, then it would be removed from this list. Or if another company then jumps up into that revenue class, then it would appear on this list. So it always stays up to date, following the criteria that you yourself defined. A few other filters worth mentioning. I'm not going to show them in detail, but under the basic category, you have, for example, the legal entity option, meaning you can narrow down based on what the actual legal entity is. Very useful in certain cases. Another useful one is website keywords. So sometimes it helps you narrow down even further than the industry classifications can. So if you know, for example, that a certain product type, a service would be mentioned on the company website, then you can try that through the website keywords filter and find more results that way. The one that I already mentioned earlier is the include exclude list option that you have right here. So let's assume for a moment that these 93 companies would be a perfect ICP for your company, for your use case. But for example, 20 of these are already your customers and you don't need to see them on this list. So if you uploaded a list containing all of your customers using the create a list, upload a list method that I showed earlier, then you could from here now exclude that list, meaning those 20 companies would be silently removed from this list. And you would actually only see the 73 companies, for example, that are actually fulfilling the criteria of this list and are not part of that uploaded list of customers that you also brought to Vainu earlier on. So a very, very useful and powerful feature in very many cases. A couple more quick things that I wanted to mention about lists themselves. As you can see, there are different ways of sorting the list that you have created. By default, we use something called Vainu score, which very simply put is just a measure of how much do we have data of these companies. So the ones that you can see here at the top are ones that we have plenty of data for. Correlates quite well with how big the companies are, because bigger companies, large enterprises have a lot of data, they have a lot of financials, they have large group data and so on and so forth, whereas small one-person companies have much less data. So it correlates very well with how big the company is. But you have other alternatives here as well. You can go with revenue, you can go with employee count, and you can go even by an alphabetical order. So company name would be your choice in that case. Also, you can choose the exact view. So we have what we call the cards view here, but you could also have a table view. We even have a new map view available. It was just recently launched, so go ahead and test it out and feel free to send any feedback if you notice any issues or any improvements there. And there's also the insights feature, which you can use to gain some understanding of lists that you have created in terms of like how big are these companies, to what industries do they belong to, and so on and so forth. And finally, if you hover over here to the actual list of different lists that you have created, you can see three little dots here, and that opens up a small menu. Duplicate is a super powerful feature which allows you to create similar lists. So let's say you have created a list with a bunch of different filters, and then you want to create a similar list which by and large has those same filters, but let's say maybe you want to change the location to a different city, for example. Then the easiest way is not to create a new list and having to define those filters over and over again, but rather just duplicate this list. So as you can see, it creates a copy that has all the same filters ready already. And then you can just change, for example, the visiting city here to something else. And it only takes you to change that one filter to have a perfect and ready running list with the different city that you decided to go with. So super useful. Another one that I wanted to mention as well is the sharing option. So if your organization has a lot of Vainu users and you want to share a list that you created with other people, you can click on the share option. In this case, I'm dealing with a demo account that doesn't have other users, but you would see here normally a list of all the users in your organization. And you could then decide whether to give individual users a view access or an editing access, or you can even apply these settings to the whole team at once if needed. Then let's super quickly talk about how you can basically then, what you can do with this list outside of Vainu's realm. So downloading lists and exporting lists. There are two buttons here at the top right, just above the first company cards. First of all, download companies, which means that you would be downloading this list as a spreadsheet, as a CSV file, as an Excel file. You can select here the data points that you want to include on your download. So you can just pick any data points that you're interested in. And once you're done with that, you'll just move on to the choose file type part. You'll choose if you want this as a CSV, as a JSON file, as an Excel file. You'll see the preview of how it looks like, so you can still go back if you notice that something is not as you expected. And then you proceed to clicking on the download Excel, which after a while, depending on the size of your list and how many data points you selected, will then end up to downloading that list on your computer. The other option is if you have an integration connected, so you have a CRM integration up and running through our connector, then you might see the Send Companies button up here. And what that looks is basically assuming you have different integrations. It gives this drop-down menu. Let's say you're sending these companies to HubSpot. You'll see a screen that looks like this. So it gives you an idea of what objects are we now creating in your CRM. Is there a segment information that will be attached to all of these companies? Who is the person who you want to assign these companies to, etc.? So this would be the correct approach to doing that. But of course, note that this feature is only available if your agreement contains connector, so the CRM integration, and if you yourself as a user have actually connected the integration, because every single individual user needs to connect the integration to the CRM themselves for this feature to work. Finally, before heading to the Q&A, I wanted to briefly also talk about triggers, because triggers is a key part of the things that you can do on Vainu's platform as well. When you create a list, as we did here, you already have a couple of options available to you on the top right hand of the list page behind the button called Track Changes. So if I click here, you can see that there is an option called New Company in List, meaning that, as I mentioned earlier, since Vainu keeps updating the list based on your criteria, if there's a new company that appears, you will get notified if you create a trigger with this New Company in List function. Another option that you have here, New Contact in List. So I didn't already mention, but there are also contact filters here that you can use. So let's briefly jump to the contact view. Here you can see all the 662 contacts that we have for these 38 companies. You can use our contact filter to narrow down to, let's say I'm only interested in the CEOs of these companies, and I'm also only interested if they have a phone number, for example. So I could apply these criteria, and now I'm probably seeing a lot less. There we go, only one contact who actually fills these criteria. You could similarly build a trigger called New Contact in List, which would then inform you if there are new contacts that actually fill this criteria at some point. But these are not the only options. If I click here on more events, or you could also just click on the little lightning icon here on the left, we'll open up our trigger feature page. And how triggers work simply is you can click on the Create a Trigger button. You would select a list. So basically any of the lists that you have created in Vainu would basically act as the target group, as the basis of your trigger. So let's use the webinar demo list that we just created. And then you define what events are actually the ones where you want to get notified. So for example, you can see some of the examples that we have available. Let's say you're only interested in news related to mergers and acquisitions. Maybe you're interested in new construction projects. Maybe you're interested in new investments that a company has made. Or maybe you're interested in any open positions that they may have. So there's a bunch of options here. You can even select multiple ones at the same time, but let's go in this case with open positions. You can even narrow down to specific keywords. So let's say you're not interested in all the open positions, but only marketing managers. Then you could type in, for example, the keyword marketing here to narrow down to those specific roles only. I'm not going to use any keywords in this case. I'll just apply it like this. So you can already see what appears here is a list of all the most recent signals that match my criteria. So belong to any of the companies that we had on the list that I created, and also are open position related. So what you can see here is just one of the examples. There's the title here, there's the date, and there's even the link to the original source. So you can go to the original source and see what they're actually dealing with there, and narrow down the trigger based on that if you want. The trigger isn't ready just by doing these 2 decisions. You still need to make these final configuration decisions on where do you actually want these notifications to be delivered. Very commonly, people just like to receive emails. So they want let's say, a daily digest to their email, sending all the fresh leads. If you have a CRM integration, you could also send them, for example, to HubSpot as a deal object. That is possible as well. You can do both as well. So as you can see, I have both of them turned on right now. Then you can also decide like during which dates, during what time do you want those notifications to appear. So you could, for example, say that every business day at noon, for example, is when you want to receive it. I'm going to put the email here so that it works perfectly fine. Let's not use HubSpot. And then you can decide how many leads are you ready to receive per day. So if you want to avoid getting huge emails with a lot of different leads, then you can always narrow it down to a smaller amount that is easier to handle if you want. But you can also just, for example, type a large amount here, which means that more or less every single signal that you receive through this trigger will actually be notified to you. So that's how you set it up. And once all of these have been defined, then you can click on the activate button at the top right corner to actually activate the trigger, and start it running, and you start receiving notifications immediately. So basically starting from the next day, for example, you'll get notifications from all the new signals that match the criteria specified in this trigger. So that was the basics of how triggers work. We went through the lists as well, how to set up different filters, how to upload lists as well. There's some stuff, for example, related to connectors down here, which is if you're dealing with CRM integrations, you can connect it from this page. Settings is here where you can change your password, change the language that you're using in the UI. So there's a lot of stuff that we didn't go through here, but I think the most important parts were handled here. So we talked about lists, we talked about triggers. I think we're ready to move on to the Q&A part. So let's see if there has been any questions so far. There was a question of, can you copy a list to another country search, for example, Sweden to Norway? Great question. I had a list here which I created during the demo, and as you can see, this one was created in Sweden. Behind the 3 dots here, you also had an option called duplicate to another database, and if I click here, it basically gives you the option of duplicating this list not to Sweden, but actually to any of the other countries that you have available. So for example, I could duplicate this to Norway. I'll click on duplicate, and as you can see, I'm automatically directed to the Norwegian database. So I'm already under Norway, and here's the duplicate list that I created. Now, of course, good to understand, of course, in this case, for example, I got 0 companies as a result because I had the location filter on, and obviously there's no Norwegian companies based on Stockholm. So you might need to make some minor changes to the actual list for them to properly apply in other places as well. But it is possible basically to duplicate the list between different databases as well. Good. Sini, you're also online. Do you have anything else on your mind?
Not really. If any other questions, feel free to ask. We have 10-ish minutes still to cover. Thank you, Marco, very much. This was super good, and I hope all of you online and those who will then got the recording afterwards will find this beneficial. 30 or 40-ish minutes together.
Yes. And there's a final poll also for you, so I'm going to start it right now. So we'd be super happy to hear on which topics would you actually be interested in learning more about in a future webinar. So there's a lot of stuff that we didn't handle today. CRM integrations, also all of our agents and Vainu's MCP, Vainu's API and the CLI that we just released, Vainu View as well. So Vainu View is basically a feature where you can see Vainu's company cards directly, for example, in a CRM or wherever your salespeople are already working. And of course, if you're also interested in a deeper dive to triggers, and you should be able to choose, it's a multiple choice question, so feel free to choose from multiple options if you're interested. I believe we have, Sini, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we have an agent-related training coming on later this year. I think it'll be in Finnish at first, but if there's enough interest, we'll be super happy to run that training in Swedish or in English as well, if there's enough interest. So right now it looks like triggers are interesting to people, at least Vainu API and CLI as well. I think that's a very, very good topic as well, since CLI is super new. Great to hear that there's interest in all of these topics as well. But hopefully this session was already useful as a refresher to the basics if you used Vainu before, or just like how to get started with Vainu if you're actually a new user. And as mentioned, this recording will appear in our help center, so feel free to check it out from there later if you missed out on something, or if you want to revisit something that we discussed today.
There has come 2 questions. I take the Milla's one first. It might be faster than the triggers to Pipedrive. So Milla is asking whether it is more efficient to choose the local currency rather than euros when it comes to revenue, so when filtering the list.
Right, local currency rather than euros. I think like in Finland's case, since we're using euros, I think it's you can just use either or. It has the same exact effect. And then the difference really comes, for example, in Sweden and Norway, where you need to make the decision on, are you more fluent in is it more understandable for you to use the local currency or to use euros? So both are just fine. It's really a matter of a personal preference in that case, I would say.
Perfect. And then Reena asks, can you show quickly the contact filter to get the correct decision makers?
Yes, that's a good one. Let me get my screen back up. There we go. So yes, I visited contact filter very briefly. Let's take a closer look. I'm going to go back to the Swedish list. I think that's easier. So this is what it looks like. There's a bunch of different ways that you can use to filter and to narrow down. I already quickly showed the function one. So we have basically our own categories of titles, meaning that, as you know very well, there is a bunch of different titles, and we've tried to normalize them into these categories so that everything that is related to HR hopefully falls under the HR function, for example. Same thing for marketing. So you can pick and choose any functions that you're actually interested in. You could also just go by the title. If you know a very, very specific title and you want to use that, that is also possible through here. This option here called Decision Maker is also basically our own qualifier that reads the title, and based on the title tries to understand if this is actually someone who is making decisions within the company. Is it someone who actually has the power to buy your service or your product, or if it's rather someone who doesn't have that those rights. So basically, decision maker tries to answer the question, are these actually people making decisions within this company? So you could add that there as well. And then you have the option of like, do I want these people to have a certain type of contact method available? So phone number, email address, LinkedIn. And as you can see, you can either choose like, any of these 3 are fine for me. Or for example, do you want to run a search that looks like this? So in this case, basically you want both a phone number and an email address to exist for these contacts to even be listed when you create this list. And I also want to mention the best contact feature, which has a slightly different approach. Best contact is basically to give you the option of always getting 1 contact per company. Because if you use the all contacts method, it might be that some companies are dropped off from your list since there's just no single contact that matches your criteria. But if you go with the best contact option, Vainu will then choose 1 single contact that matches your criteria best. So for example, you could say that, I prefer getting the HR contact. But if the HR contact is not available, then Vainu will use the next best contact using this kind of selection tree that you can see here. So if there's no HR, let's check if there's administration, let's see if there's finance, let's see if there's CEO, and so on and so forth. So you'll always get like one contact per company on this list in every single case, assuming there is at least one contact for each company. But there always is at least the CEO, since we get that data from the official sources. They might not have a phone number, they might not have an email, but there's at least always a name for a CEO for every single company. Hopefully that answered the question about the contact filters.
At least for me, it did. Perfect, Marco. We do have Antti. If you are still online, I can see your question about the Pipedrive and triggers and contacts. I think it might be better if you, Antti, please can contact us via Vainu's chat or via email. We might need a bit dig a bit deeper with that case instead of trying to figure it out here. So please be in touch with. Okay, you are online. So Antti, please chat with us inside Vainu's chat or via email. We can dig a bit deeper with that case, how the settings are and what is the case.
Okay. Yeah, I think just as a very, very quick example, as Sini mentioned, it will be useful to look at your use case like in more specific. But in general, when you're sending to a CRM, as you're talking about in your case, you should usually be like here in the trigger menu, able to select like what is the primary object that we're sending through the trigger. And then if you want to send some other objects as well. So in your case, you were talking about contacts. So maybe the first thing is to make sure that you're not only sending a deal or whatever it's called in Pipedrive, but also that you're sending a contact object here as well, or maybe even a company object as well. So this is the part where you usually define those things. But as Sini mentioned, I think it's useful if you send a message to our support, either through the chat in the bottom right corner or by email to support@vainu.com, so we can take a closer look at the specifics of your case in this case.
Perfect. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, everyone online. And as said, we are planning to have either something related to Vainu's AI tools, or then multiply it with MCP and CLI and all that new stuff that that has come. But let's see, it will be late October. We will inform you guys on that. Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.